All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman. And today we are talking about whether or not the Falcons will redeem themselves from Super Bowl 51 and the 28-3 loss, and whether Falcons head coach Arthur Smith is going to be the one to do it.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me, I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on Twitter at falcfans, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And in today's Locked On Falcons podcast is brought to you by GetUpside. You can download the GetUpside app for free and use the promo code touchdown to get 25 cents back per gallon in cash back on your first tank. So, guys, I want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, and Spotify. And of course, now on YouTube. Make sure you leave a comment. Make sure you give us that like when you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. So today's episode goes back to a question a listener sent in, or not really a question, more of a comment that someone sent in last month about not being over the Super Bowl. And we'll just sort of give my thoughts on that, and sort of going back 5 years now that's been removed since the Falcons lost Super Bowl 51, and sort of then pivoting to sort of what's going on with this current team and whether or not they can sort of redeem that Super Bowl loss. So let's get into that question from mflores8579. He says, maybe I care more about this football team than I should because I'm still in pain over that embarrassing Super Bowl loss. I don't think I'll ever truly be over it until we win a Super Bowl, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. Thanks for listening, brother. Yeah, M. Flores, it is tough, right? And I talked about, still the lingering effects of that Super Bowl like 2 years ago when the 49ers and Shanahan were back in the Super Bowl on the podcast. But now that we're kind of a few more years removed from it, and now 5 years, let's continue talking about it. And I've constantly referred to it as sort of the ongoing psychological and emotional trauma that we all collectively as Falcon fans underwent on that horrible evening in February of 2017. And, to varying degrees, depending on the individual, each person has moved past it to varying degrees, but I don't think any of us are fully 100% past it. Really, as you say, until the Falcons kind of redeem themselves and get back to a Super Bowl and ultimately win a Super Bowl. And a problem, of course, is that we all sort of sit here and wait with bated breath until that day arrives. And it feels like, similar to as you sent this in, like 2-3 weeks ago, it kind of does feel like we're as far away from that point than we've been in the last 5 years. But we'll circle back to that topic a little bit later. And I feel like for the most part, I've made peace with the idea that the Falcons may not get back to the Super Bowl anytime soon. And that was a mindset that I kind of adopted in the weeks and months after that Super Bowl loss back in 2017. And it really boils down to kind of a dichotomy between, the fan in me and the analyst in me. And the analyst in me kind of knows that the odds are not in this team's favor to get back to a point where they were in the second half of that game with a 99% win probability. The chances of them being back in a even better position and being 100% win probability just is not low. But the fan in me still looks at those low chances and those low odds or whatever and says, you know what, but it's not zero. And so it's kind of the old Dumb and Dumber thing where it's like, so you're telling me there's a chance. Like, that's kind of how the fan always hope springs eternal. And I know most of you guys that listen to the podcast know that when that those two warring sides in me, the analyst more often than not on the podcast wins out, right? And I've learned over the years to trust the analyst a little bit more than the fan in me, because the fan in me is ridiculous, right? Uh, but I think when you look at the situation, going back to that team, and the thing that I tried to process in the weeks and months after that Super Bowl loss was like understanding that Kyle Shanahan's presence and the fact that he wasn't going to be there after that year was instrumental in that team making it as far as they did, and understanding at least, and I've said this before on the podcast, where it felt like if not for Kyle Shanahan's play calling, that was probably an 8-18. Like without a, or whether you want to attribute that to Kyle Shanahan, which I do, but without a historically great offense, let's say that. That was probably at best an 8-18 in that 2016 season. And we know that while we were capable of achieving an offense that could still be a top 10 potential offense, um, you know, that unit in 2016 was like a 99th percentile unit because like they still rank in the top 10 of all offenses in NFL history in points scored. And I looked at the DVOA rankings to see where they rank there all time. And DVOA metrics go back almost 40 years to 1983 at Football Outsiders. And that 2016 offense is 35th in offensive DVOA. And that, given 40 years of data, that puts that offense in the 97th percentile. And so when we were coming off of that 2016 season with the new offensive coordinator Steve Sarkisian, and I remember getting into many an argument with fans over that offseason where that they had this belief that because we had the same playbook and the same talent that we could get right back to that. And while I thought that the offense could be good, and we talked about it that season, and talking about like the potential regression that they would show if they had a quote unquote normal amount of regression that most of those historic offenses had, they'd still probably be a top 3 to 5 offense in 2017. So it wasn't as if the team was incapable of achieving at a high level. But you kind of needed the defense to kind of pick up some of the slack. And based off of where they had left off in that 2016 season down the stretch and how well they had played, it felt like the defense was on the rise. And we did see the defense improve in 2017. Unfortunately, the offense regressed a whole lot more than when we thought it did. But, that led to us going into 2018 and everybody being very hyped about the defense. Now, I personally wasn't part of that group because I saw the losses of pass rushers like Adrian Claiborne and John Terry Poe that offseason and felt like the defense wasn't going to make the strides that we needed it to make because the pass rush was not going to necessarily be as good. Because the fan of me was hopeful that Grady Jarrett and Vic Beasley and Tack McKinley were going to make these big leaps to fill that void. But the analyst in me knew or suspected at least that they probably weren't going to do that. But we saw the defense take a step back in that 2018 season. We saw the offense take a step forward in that 2018 season under Sark. But the team ultimately chose to fire Steve Sarkisian. And I agreed with the decision at the time because while I thought Sark was perfectly capable of producing a top 10 offense as he did in 2018, I think they were 8th in DVOA that year. He always was going to leave a little bit wanting because as we saw throughout those 2 years, whenever the Falcons faced a formidable defense, it always felt like this offense really, really struggled in those types of games. And when we're talking about redeeming the team, you're going to face some really good defenses come January in the postseason. And if you're always going to be let down by that, there's a lot of room for improvement in terms of what you can do offensively from a play calling standpoint. And then the Falcons hired Dirk Cutter. And it was kind of then where I was like, oh, this is not going the way that we hoped. And the analyst in me knew that that was a bad hire. The fan in me was still hopeful, though, that, the defense could pick up the slack. But we saw that offseason, the team doubled down on Vic Beasley. They botched their free agent signings on the offensive line. They failed to address the pass rush really at all that entire offseason. And it kind of felt like, okay, there's going to be no redemption moving forward. Again, the fan still is hopeful. The fan is still hopeful that this team, despite not feeling like they're going to redeem the Super Bowl, could at least still be a playoff contending team. And that would buy them time to figure things out. But after, the 2019 season, you kind of knew, okay, this is done. And 2020, bringing Dan Quinn and that regime back for another year was just essentially delaying the inevitable. And we saw that all ultimately play out. And then ultimately the Falcons hire Arthur Smith. and you're sitting there getting back to being hopeful again that he's going to be the guy that's going to bring that offensive mojo back. And Dean Pease is going to be the guy that can help rebuild the defense, and it's going to take some time to do that. But ultimately, they'll get this team and this team back on track. And while you know it's not going to be an immediate fix, you're just hoping that, okay, the 2021 Falcons can kind of pick up where that 2018 team should have left off and be back in the postseason mix. But we didn't see things go quite so smoothly this past year. And we'll get more into that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But before we get there, guys, I want to again thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And I always have recommendations for what your second listen should be. And of course, why not check out any of the local shows, particularly the Locked On Hawks podcast, where you can get the lowdown on all the Atlanta Hawks. Get Brad Rowland, the host of Locked On Hawks, thoughts on all the big trade deadline moves around the NBA and how that affects the Hawks by checking out and subscribing to Locked On Hawks on your preferred podcast platform. So today's episode is brought to you by a new app called GetUpside, where you can get cash back on every gallon of gas that you put in your car and save every time you fill up. And I know for those of you that are always stuck in bumper to bumper traffic down in Atlanta, you are always burning through gas and you're looking for ways to get cash back at the pump. And there's no catch. It's all free. All you got to do is download GetUpside in the App Store or on Google Play. You go to any of the thousands of eligible gas stations near you, you claim their offer, you fill up, and they put money directly into your account. And you can cash out anytime with direct payments into your bank account. You can use PayPal. You can get them on gift cards. I like to get mine on Amazon gift cards. And now when you open an account on GetUpside and use our special promo code Touchdown, you get a bonus 25 cents back per gallon on your first fill up. So don't pay full price at the pump anymore. Download the free GetUpside app and use the promo code Touchdown when you sign up. That's GetUpside, promo code Touchdown, to start saving every time you fill up. So there's one football game left to be played this year, and then we have several months without football to be played. And if you're looking to get in on this final football action, the LA Rams are favored over the Cincinnati Bengals by 4 points. Maybe you feel better about the over and under, that this is going to be a shootout or a defensive contest, and you're looking at that over or under of 48.5 points as something to wager on. And of course, BetOnline is the best spot for wagering on sports, whether they've been covering you all season long with the best odds, props, and lines. And they still have more to come. Even though football season is over, BetOnline is still a great place for up-to-the-minute info on pro and college hoops, NHL, boxing, UFC, all the way to your favorite Vegas casino game. So don't wait and take advantage of all the amazing offers available at BetOnline for the 2022 calendar year by heading to betonline.net. BetOnline, where the game starts. So year one of Arthur Smith's tenure didn't quite go as hoped. The analyst in me is very, very skeptical at this point in time, but the fan in me still remains somewhat hopeful. But, going down that DVOA rabbit hole, I noticed that the 2021 Falcons offense, historically speaking for the Falcons going back to 1983, was the third worst offense the Falcons have ever had, according to DVOA. Even worse, slightly worse than that 2007 unit. And I noticed, along with that 2007 unit being the fourth worst, that the other two worst offenses than this 2021 one was the 2000 and 1987 offenses. And I noticed a trend with that because after those terrible years, the Falcons made a change at quarterback. In 1987, they used their number one pick on Chris Miller. That 87 season was a sort of strike season where there were replacement players, and the Falcons went through a bunch of quarterbacks that year and ultimately turned the keys over to Chris Miller at the end of that 87 season. And then in 1988, he was the full-time starter. And then in 2000, of course, that was a pretty rough year. Has a lot of parallels to this 2021 season with an aging quarterback, a bad offensive line, bad defense, etc. But the very next year, they went out and got Michael Vick. And then, of course, the 2007 season, that was a disaster. They went out and got Matt Ryan the very next year. And I know everybody who's, involved in the ongoing Matt Ryan Civil War is losing their minds right now with me saying that. But, I continue to make this point, and I've been making this point for over a year. This is not really about what I want to happen. This is not about what I think should happen. But the analyst in me is just talking to you about what will happen. I think what will happen is you're going to see this team invest in the quarterback, right? And I've been saying this for over a year that there's consequences and repercussions for teams losing. Coaches get fired, GMs get fired, and yes, players get fired, and that can include quarterbacks. And I feel like this is the reality of the situation. And I've been basically saying this, that unless the Falcons can show significant improvement in 2022 from where they were in 2021, there's going to be consequences and repercussions, and that may include moving on from Matt Ryan. And probably will include moving on from Matt Ryan. And I don't have as much of willingness, the analyst in me, I guess you could say, of trying to put a positive spin on the 2021 season, despite the team winning 7 games, and however you want to spin that, despite the talent, despite whatever the case may be. I look at this past season as, a bad team, or at least, a bad team winning a bunch of close games against other bad teams. And while that's not meaningless, I can't put too much stock in that and say that's a positive trend, because the analyst in me knows that, a team's record in one-score games does not typically hold up year to year. Now, it did for Mike Smith for the first 5 years of his tenure in Atlanta, but then it didn't, and then he got fired. And you look at recent years where, you go back to the 12 teams that had a winning record, right? On average, you're going to, win as many games and lose as many games in one-score games as you would. You'll go 500, right? So if you look at the 12 teams in 2020 that had a winning record in one-score games, only 5 of them had a winning record again in 2021. You look at the 13 teams that had a winning record in one-score games in 2019, only 6 of them had it in 2020. So it seems like at best you're looking at a coin toss situation where the Falcons, who had a winning record in 2021, one of 11 teams that had a winning record in one-score games, it's basically a coin toss whether they're going to continue and sustain that into 2022. And when you factor in that they have currently, based off of last year's records, the 9th hardest schedule, and then you look at, there's 6 other teams that had winning records in one-score ball games that also have, like, one of the 10 to 12 hardest schedules in the league next year. It kind of feels like the Falcons are a pretty good bet to be in that half that will have struggles to sustain that one-score success as they did a year ago. So again, the analyst in me doesn't sit here and say there's no chance of that happening, but it knows that the odds are not necessarily stacked in the Falcons' favor. And I think that really does put a lot of pressure on this current regime to get things right, not only this season, but obviously this offseason. All these things are very important. And, part of my issue is I think a lot of fans has this mindset that this current regime has a long runway to get things back on track. And I just don't think the timeline really works out in that regard. And we'll explain that further as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But before we get there, guys, I do want to remind you that, Super Week brought to you by GetUpside. It has all week long on the Locked On Podcast Network. We've had you covered all week long for this big game this weekend, whether that's Locked On Rams and Locked On Bengals, being in LA covering the game, Locked On NFL, etc. So make sure you subscribe to those podcasts on your preferred podcast platforms, including on YouTube. So we know a new year begins and everybody has New Year's resolutions, but now that we're in the month of February, most people have given up on their New Year's resolutions. And that's a shame if your New Year's resolution was to eat healthier, because you probably could have sustained it longer if you had made Built Bar part of your plan. So why not make Built Bar the best tasting protein bar that tastes like a candy bar part of your plan moving forward? Eating healthy can be tough because it's kind of boring, but Built Bar allows you to stick to your resolution because it tastes good and you'll want to eat it too because it's good for you. Built Bars are low in sugar, calories, and carbs, but they're high in protein and fiber. They come in a variety of delicious flavors. You know that when you're eating on a diet, you're eating kind of the same boring old foods every single day, but Built Bar brings that variety with delicious flavors like coconut brownie chunk, eggnog, coconut almond, peanut butter brownie, and so much more. So head on over to built.com and use the promo code LOCK15 and you can get 15% off your order. That's LOCK15 for 15% off at built.com. So, I talk to fans a lot, and I think we all are mostly in agreement that, this process to get the Falcons back to, respectability is going to take a couple of years. And I think they believe that, Terry and him Terry and Arthur, have this plan and, just give them time, just give them, 3 or more years to get everything into place and we'll come out looking good. And that's perfectly a fine opinion to believe that, but I just have a hard time believing that Terry and them are going to get that type of runway. And, longtime listeners know I was openly skeptical last offseason whether this regime had a real plan in place or that they were just kind of making it up as they go. And we'll sort of see where I feel about that, 3, 4 months from now, if I change my opinion on that. But, I still have that question and we're going to find out this offseason. But, I just have a hard time buying this notion that Arthur Blank is going to have this patience with this new regime and watch them struggle for, potentially 2 or more years and still feel like, okay, we're going to keep them in place because they have this long-term plan. And, let's imagine a scenario where the Falcons, and I think it's a likely scenario, where the Falcons draft a quarterback on day 2 this year. I think really the only situation where Matt Ryan is able to retain his job beyond the season is if the team has a successful year, Matt Ryan has a successful year. And again, what those benchmarks are, is depending on a variety of factors that it's hard to sort of put a hard number on. But let's just say, I think you got to see Matt Ryan, perform like a top 12-ish quarterback. You probably have to see this team perform, at least improve their record this upcoming season to get at least to 8-9. And I'll admit that, like, if they can get to 8-9 with this much tougher schedule, then that to me is a lot worthy of praise. That outcome is a lot more worthy of praise in 2022 than a lot of the praise that I think this regime has gotten in 2021 for, what to me is a pretty ho-hum at best season. But it's hard for me, and I've been saying this again, that this is not Aaron thinking that he wants this to happen. Aaron wants the team, right? I'm going to talk in third person, but I want the team to be successful. But if they're not successful, like, I just can't see a scenario where they continue to trot out an aging and expensive Matt Ryan and feel like, oh, things are headed in the right direction. And again, like, people perceive this as like I have some personal beef with Matt Ryan. It's not a personal beef with Matt Ryan, but I just know, again, the analyst in me knows how the league operates. Like, teams just do not pay premiums for quarterbacks to be bad football teams. Like, you see that. Look at the Rams and the Bengals, right? After years of mediocrity with Andy Dalton, they moved on to Joe Burrow. After years of or not too much mediocrity with the Rams, but of basically not being a Super Bowl team, which is their aspirations, they moved on from Jared Goff to get Matt Stafford, right? The 49ers went 6-10 and then drafted Trey Lance. The Vikings are going through the same situation with Matt Ryan as with Kirk Cousins right now. It's like, is this the year to move on from Kirk Cousins? Can they salvage this Kirk Cousins situation with a new head coach and Kevin O'Connell, right? And it's like, you got 1 year left on Kirk Cousins' contract or whatever the case may be, and that's about it. Like, you got one shot, one bite at this apple, and the Falcons might have 2 if you count 2021 and 2022, but that's going to be it. If they can't figure it out in those 2 chances, then they're moving on, guys. And so, like, I can't sit here, the analyst in me can't sit here and pretend that, like, it's all good. Like, we can just continue to be mediocre and bad. And we just need to continue to trot out the same formula every single year. And we just need more time, right? Time is a luxury in this league. And it's a luxury that only teams that win can afford. And until the Falcons start winning, they're going to be in poverty, so to speak. So I think this new regime has to start getting positive results. Whether that's putting more wins in the win column, whether that's putting more points on the scoreboard, we have to see those results sooner versus later. And when we talk about DVOA, I went and looked at this 2021 offense and not just looking at DVOA, looking at how many points they scored and measured that against the league average, right? And this offense in 2021, was 20% worse in terms of points output this year than the league average was this year. And if you go back 40 years, again, that's one of the worst marks, one of the 4 or 5 worst marks that the Falcons offense has been in 40 or so years. And when you look at that drop off from 2020 to this 2021 unit, the 2020 offense was basically league average, right? I think they were like 0.6 points off of the league average. And so, like, when you look at that drop off from 2020 to 2021, it's one of the bigger drop offs you've seen from this Falcon team in a while. Like, that's a 20% drop essentially. And you find, in order to find comparable drop offs going back the last, few decades, you see the 2012 to 2013 drop off, which was about 21%, the 2002 to '03 drop off, which was about 26%, and the 98 to 99 drop off, which was about 44%. And guess what happened in each one of those follow up years? The Falcons lost their best players to injuries, right? In 2013, that was mostly Julio and Roddy. '03, that was Michael Vick. And '99, that was Jamal Anderson. And like when I see people sit here and talk about this, like saying like, "Oh, the Falcons won the Julio Jones trade," I just look at this information. I'm like, how? How do people figure that? Where the Falcons just had this historic drop off, in large part due to losing Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley. And I'm baffled by how people can sit here and say with a straight face that acting like losing those guys and getting draft capital for them is a good move, right? When the results in the field are telling you that, that second round pick or whatever we wind up getting, for Julio Jones this year and or Calvin Ridley this year, since it seems like we're headed in that direction, like unless that player comes in and can single-handedly make up the difference, again, I'm being hyperbolic when I say that, but like unless that player can make that type of impact, like how are we sitting here saying that we won these trades, right? And kudos to Arthur Blank sitting here, doing a great job with public relations by talking recently about Calvin Ridley and his situation and saying like, oh, we've given Calvin all the support that he needs and we'd love to have him back, but it's really on him. And so he's put the ball in his court, and that's a great way of winning the PR battle in terms of that. So if Calvin Ridley ultimately gets traded, it'll be like, oh, well, we tried everything we could to keep him, and it's his fault or whatever the case may be. So kudos to Arthur Blank. That's why you're Arthur Blank. But I sit here and I go with this regime. If we're living in a world, and it seems like we're heading that direction, where Julio's not here and Calvin's not here, and we're sitting here, okay, how is this offense going to be effective? Well, it's got to be Kyle Pitts. It's got to be whoever we wind up drafting at wide receiver or whatever the case may be, coming and having a Justin Jefferson like rookie season or something like that. I don't know. You tell me, how good does that player have to be right off the bat to make up this gap, right? If this offensive line doesn't get fixed, if this defense doesn't get fixed, right? If whoever we draft this year on day 2 of the draft to be Matt Ryan's heir apparent doesn't work out, or next year if we wind up picking high again and we're drafting a quarterback again, and that player doesn't work out, then like we're going to be sitting here in 2 years from now, guys. And I'm going to sit here and going like, if this offense isn't back to being at least an above average unit, which they were, for most of Matt Ryan's tenure, I don't see how Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot are going to have this long leash at that point in time to continue the team down the path, right? They're going to continue to have Arthur Blank's going to continue to be like, oh yeah, like these guys got a plan. Right. And again, I know it sounds doom and gloom when I say all this, but like I'm just trying to be real with you guys. I'm being that analyst that you guys love and hate, I guess, here on the podcast. But like to bring it full circle back to the whole 28-3, like sitting and enduring all the 28-3 jokes that we've endured over the last 5 years has been tough. But like it's not going to get better if the Falcons don't find themselves removing themselves from the bottom of the league. And removing themselves from being a team that's picking in the top 10 every single April for the next 3 to 5 years, which they could be on the path to being. And everybody's going to sit here and be like, oh man, what happened to the Falcons? They blew a 28-3 lead, and then they went into a nosedive and became one of the worst organizations in football for a decade. Right? We've already 5 years into that, guys. Right? I don't want to be the Jets. I don't want to be the Giants. These teams these last couple of years that are like, oh, they were considered laughing stocks and poorly run, and they can't figure anything out. Right? Look how bad their ownership is. All these various things. There's just something broken about those organizations. I don't want the Falcons to be there, guys. So right now we're at a point where we're just really far removed from that redemption conversation about winning a Super Bowl. Now it's just like, can we just get back to being a respectable football team that's in the playoff hunt year in and year out? And again, kudos to Arthur Smith with a soft schedule, getting this team to playing meaningful games in December. And again, if you're the type of Falcon fan that wants to praise that, then by all means do it. But I'm gonna sit here and tell you that like there's no looking back from that. Is the point I'm trying to make. It's like we have to be that team every single year. That's the starting point. That's the bare minimum of acceptable performance that we can get. And so when I look at this team and look at this first year under Arthur Smith, I don't look at a whole lot of things. At least the analyst in me doesn't look at a whole lot of things and sees things that I'm like, oh man, that makes me really optimistic about. Like I look at the, Kyle Pitts doing Kyle Pitts things, the 300 plus yard games, and if that turns into 10 100 plus yard games in 2022, then okay, like that's something worthwhile. That's gonna make it where the analyst in me, sees something, but I got to see it to believe it. Now, the fan in me still remains hopeful, as the fan always does. The fan in me hopes that they hit on some of these draft picks. The fan in me hopes that they hit on some free agent signings for once. That would be a welcome change from the previous regime, right? To actually do a good job in free agency. And the fan in me is still hopeful that this team gets back to respectability in 2022. But I just hope we're not having a conversation again next year about them being a historically bad 7-10 team, whether we're looking at DVOA or point differential, that if we're only going to win 7 or 8 games this year, which again, I don't feel like is a huge stretch to expect and want, right? It seems like a low bar that they should be able to clear, right? Then hopefully there's a legit version of winning 7 or 8 games this season where, we can look at the DVOA or we can look at the point differential and see a team that, like they actually were a legit 7 or 8 win team or whatever the case may be. So, I would say Inflora's 8.579. We kind of got to get over the Super Bowl, right? Because it feels like right now we got bigger fish to fry. Like, we're doing the Super Bowl, like that ship has sailed, right? Like maybe we get there one day. Maybe we get there one day, but that seems many years away. We need to redeem just being a respectable football team at this point in time. So, I know this portrait I've painted today sounds like it's all terrible, but it's just like, hopefully they just get it right sooner rather than later, because this has not been fun. These last 5 years have not been fun to just see the team just kind of completely go into whatever they're in right now. And so I would like to believe that Arthur Smith and company are going to be the ones to resurrect us and get us out of this, but they got to have a plan. They got to execute that plan. And it remains to be seen if they have one and if they are going to execute it. And so again, I'm in wait and see mode. That's the analyst in me. The fan remains hopeful, but the analyst in me is like, I'll believe it when I see it. So we'll just sort of have to see how it goes this next couple of months. And we'll see how, the game on Sunday goes. And we'll talk about it Monday. We'll also be doing mock draft Monday, our first one of the offseason. And, every Monday from here on out, will be devoted to breaking down somebody's mock draft, whether it's mine, whether it's some other person's, maybe it's some of y'all's submissions or whatever the case may be. And then also, we can do a mailbag Monday as well. So you guys can submit your questions via Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons, via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. All great places to get your, questions potentially answered on a future episode of the podcast. We still got one more year in positional review to do this, the all important, the all meaningful, the one that matters the most. That is the special teams unit. We'll probably get to that on Tuesday, unless, some other big news happens in the meantime. And then that will sort of wrap up our sort of look back at 2021, and we can fully embrace the 2022 offseason. So that's what's in store for you guys next week. We'll also have some guests on as well. And that will do it, guys. I appreciate you for tuning in. I hope you have a great weekend. I hope you enjoy the game. I hope you enjoy the mediocre commercials that they give us each and every year. Can't imagine people paying all that money for a middling performance. Is similar like the Falcons, right? Matt Ryan is the embodiment of a mediocre Super Bowl commercial at this point in time. So hopefully we'll get a couple of good commercials, and maybe that's a positive sign that we'll get one more good year out of Matt Ryan moving forward. People paying a lot of money for not that good. So that's where I'll leave it, guys. I'm sure people will have fun with that in the comments. But So, if you're invested in this game, why not make sure that you get all the right bets going by subscribing to the Locked On Bets podcast, where handicapping expert Lee Sterling is giving you the lowdown on all his daily picks, his blowout specials, and of course his lock of the day. And I'm sure Lee also has some great props for you for this big game this weekend. So, guys, that will do it for us. I hope you have a great weekend. Till then.